school. So I'm going to talk briefly about a topic maybe that doesn't feel like it fits in the topic of this conference, but I promise you I think it does. So it's community-driven, technology-guided redistricting to foster more socioeconomically diverse schools. So at Northeastern, I lead a lab called the Plural Connections Group. The mission of the lab is to use tools from computation and design to try to foster pluralism, which is an inclusive response to differences in society. And most of our work is focused on education or media, so a lot of the stuff that Chris was talking about. I'm going to talk mostly about the education work today. Everything I'll talk about is the work of an amazing team of people, and that's in collaboration with folks at Georgia Tech and MIT as well. I swear my slides look different than what they look like. So I'll talk about this issue of school segregation for a second. So despite 70 years since segregation by race being formally outlawed by Brown versus Board of Education, we still have pretty segregated schools in this country. And that's of course a concern because segregation segregation by race can segregate by poverty, it can segregate resources from students and families who need those resources. But I think it's also a threat to democracy because if we want to build a healthy, well-functioning, pluralistic democracy, we need young people to connect with each other, we need families to connect with each other from the earliest ages, and that's not happening. In many ways, segregation is actually getting worse in this country, which is surprising. And there's a lot of reasons why there's segregation. One is because of how school districts will draw what's called school attendance boundaries. So this is a map of Atlanta. These are elementary school attendance boundaries in Atlanta. So basically, school districts will draw lines around neighborhoods and say certain neighborhoods have access to certain schools. Now, on its own, this is innocuous. It seems like a fine way to assign students to schools. But the issue, of course, occurs when you have underlying patterns of residential segregation. So if you look at Atlanta, the white population in Atlanta is predominantly concentrated in the north and the northeast parts of the city, and the population of color in the south and the southwest. And you can imagine what the schools in these different parts of the city therefore look like. Now, what's exciting is that these districts can actually decide to change how these boundaries look. They can draw these boundaries however they want. And so in theory, Atlanta could draw boundaries that cut across the diagonal of the city if they wanted to use student assignment policies as a way to bring different kids from different backgrounds into schools together. But of course, if you do that, you might increase driving times for families. You might start to touch property values, which is a sacred cow, I think, for a lot of parents when they're deciding which homes to buy and then where to send their kids to school. And so we were really curious a few years ago, we started this work, we were kind of just generally curious, what if school districts redrew their boundaries? How much could they actually integrate schools while constraining how much we change driving times, right? So we want to redraw boundaries, we want to see how much we might be able to foster integration, but we don't want kids to be on a bus for a really long amount of time because that leads to other negative academic and other effects. And so we basically started to develop redistricting algorithms. And so this is similar to the work in political science, but focused on education. And we used not generative AI, but other kinds of AI, so specifically constraint programming and tools from the operations research community, basically to simulate redrawings of attendance boundaries across thousands of districts in the US. And it was exciting to find that across a lot of districts, you might actually change boundaries in ways that reduce segregation and also reduce driving distances. So that was surprising to us because a lot of times integration and driving time are pitted as being at odds with one another, but it seems like in many places you can have your cake and eat it too, even if it's a small piece of cake, even if you're only integrating a little bit, you can still see gains and actually also see reductions in driving times. So that was exciting, but up until this point, this was very top-down. It was a bunch of us researchers kind of deciding what's important and then creating algorithms to simulate policy changes. I don't think anybody wants actual local public policy to be made in that way. And so what we really wanted to do was essentially get the community involved. We know that if you're actually going to deploy this stuff in school districts, you need to start with what communities want for their own kids and their own families. And so what we wanted to do was develop a model or develop a system where we first hear from communities share what's important to them, policymakers listen to that, they process that feedback, they get help from tools like these redistricting algorithms and other data tools in order to propose first drafts of what boundary changes might look like, and then share that back with communities, and communities then opine and give feedback on those possible policies, and that sort of starts this flywheel of community engagement. And so over the past couple of years, we had an opportunity to work with a large school district in North Carolina, Winston-Salem, Forsyth County Schools, and then just maybe west of Duke. This is a 50,000 student school district. They're very segregated. They haven't changed their boundaries in a generation, in 30 years. And so we had an opportunity through a federal grant program 2 years ago. The Department of Education was giving out grants called Fostering Diverse Schools, and so we were able to, through that grant program, work with Winston-Salem, talk to thousands of community members, hear what their hopes and concerns about these possible changes were, use generative AI and other tools to really process that feedback, and also develop new generative AI tools to share that feedback back in accessible ways with communities, and factor in some of the varied concerns and priorities communities have. Of course, diversity is one thing that some people want in their schools, but they also want to go to schools that are close to home. They also want their kids to go to schools with other kids who they've gone to schools with in previous grades. And so we kind of expanded our redistricting algorithms to try to trade off between these multiple, sometimes competing priorities. And fortunately, we're able to produce a set of boundaries that could reduce driving times, could increase diversity, and also do that while keeping kids together and not moving too many kids around. And so the school board actually just approved these boundaries a couple months ago to advance towards implementation, and so now we're working with the district to try to implement this. And so not all generative AI, but sort of a hybrid, I guess, of AI tools to really and human insight and sort of human input to try to arrive at some policy change. So, thank you.